Well, brethren, there is a tree that grows in the mountains, desert mountains of the southwest at high altitudes, from which we can learn a few lessons. That tree is called the bristlecone pine. Like the church, it grows in scattered clusters throughout the subalpine regions of the south and the west. It's also one of the longest lived organisms that God has created. The oldest known specimen is estimated to be well over 5,000 years old. Now, it grows in the alpine band between 5,600 feet and 11,000 feet, in poor soil, in extremes of cold, heat, and moisture. Now, just saying that God created that tree, it opens up controversy in today's world, but I firmly believe that He created it. What do you believe? How do I demonstrate my beliefs? How do you demonstrate your beliefs? Do you have endurance? Will you maintain your practice and belief in the face of controversy? Now, most of us here have come through some serious controversy. Or will you allow practices from the world to filter into your life? And we know that God has given the world over to delusion and a mirage. And that mirage is based on the premise that we have the right to do whatever we desire. Whatever we desire, no matter how perverse. We're being pounded in today's world by the notion that we should not judge others based on their frame of reference, our frame of reference, our culture or their culture. But judgment is what we are being taught. We must choose God's will and God's righteousness. We don't want to give up our crown seeking that human goodness. And I trust that no one in this room or on the connection is going to do so. We must judge righteous judgment. Let's begin today in Psalm 1. Psalm 1. It says, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And he will be like a tree firmly planted by the streams of water, which yields its fruit in the season, and its leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Eternal knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." And we're to be the bride of Christ. And in the days leading up to the wedding, which we hope is sooner rather than later, what is to be the focus of the bride? Is she to be focused on her career? Is she focused on entertainment? Is she focused on anything else? No, her focus is on the wedding and purity for her future husband. Let's step over to Ephesians 5. Do a quick check there. Ephesians 5 and verse 25. Let's read a couple of verses here. It says, "Husbands, love your wife, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water of the word." This is how Phillips phrases it. Remember, that means the husband must give his wife the same sort of love that Christ gave the church when he sacrificed himself for her. Christ gave himself to make her holy, having cleansed her through the baptism of his word, to make her an altogether glorious church in his eyes. She is to be free from spots, wrinkles, or any other disfigurement, a church holy and perfect. So now we're entering the world's season of joy. And I say that with a sarcasm font because we know that there's a lot of violence that goes on this time of year, and there's a lot of domestic violence that goes on this time of year associated with the holidays. But Halloween and Christmas and other holidays are designed to make disobedience to God appeal to our carnal curiosity and human desire. But in one regard, they're easily dismissed because we can see that they have pagan origins. On the other hand, the appeal and the beauty of some of the trappings of the season are extremely difficult to resist. The tunes are catchy, the decorations are attractive, some downright beautiful, and the children enjoy them greatly. Yet we are to reject them. Yes, it is difficult, and we'll look at this a little bit more in a few minutes. There's almost an entire generation of the church that has vanished because they could not accept that God's way is better. And when they saw opportunity, they grabbed it and left. Sadly. They fell victim to the reasoning that all these Christian sects cannot be wrong, that there is a way to pick up a turd by the clean end, because the children enjoy it so much. Now, because we have grown up in a culture that idolizes tolerance and acceptance, it is no wonder that the exclusive nature of Christianity is a stumbling block for many. However, let's look at John 14. John 14, verse 6. John 14, verse 6, Jesus replied, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have known me, you have known my Father too. You will know my Father too. And from now on, you do know him and have seen him. However, John 14:6 is clear that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. There are not many paths to God. Now, if you combine that with John 6:44, with which we're all familiar, it says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. They're both on the same page. They're both working to bring us to the kingdom, to purify the bride. And we also heard about the anointing of this high priest and his sons during the feast. How the priests were separated and set apart as God's property and as an extension of God's realm, which is what we are as well. Their very life was to be lived on a level above that of the world around them. Come out of her, my people, is a good reference. Now let's consider two attacks on the exclusive nature of the gospel in our life that are present in contemporary American culture and have been present since the beginning of the church. Pluralism is the idea that all religions are equally valid paths to God. Since tolerance is so valued in our postmodern culture, pluralism lets people off the hook. You believe what you want to believe, and I'll believe what I want to believe. We don't have to look at anything and maybe change our lives in any way. Depending on the context, the term covers a wide variety of theological and philosophical discussions. At least 4 different concepts can be implied by this term, although each will revolve around the different religions' belief systems working together. In many cases, this term is a synonym for religious tolerance, although the two concepts have distinct meanings. Religious tolerance implies that each person is entitled to his or her set of beliefs without judgment or conformity to some central cultural or societal standard. It is a doctrine of religious tolerance that is implicit in the United States Constitution, which grants the right to freedom of religion. While religious pluralism includes tolerance, it is a more broad term that asserts that possible religious truths and values exist in many different doctrines, not solely that of the particular individual. Some theologians will argue that an omniscient deity, some will say such as God, created all the religions in order to speak to people in ways that most appeal or relate to their circumstances in life. As such, even though their customs are different, they are all from the same source. Further, pluralism suggests that if all religions are from the same source, then all must be possessing of a similar truth. This argument stresses the similarities between religion, often citing common stories, figures, and doctrines. Now, suggesting that all religions have truth and value challenges religions that preach an exclusivist idea. Some religions will assert, using quotes from relevant texts, that their way is the only way to live correctly. A few go so far as to insist that those who do not convert will be punished in an afterlife, or should not be closely associated with on earth. Doctrines such as this are difficult to resolve, and pluralists are often forced to resort to a tolerance doctrine, as it is paradoxical to embrace both an inclusivist and exclusivist view. Naturally, God has a few things to say about pluralism. If you look at Exodus 22, verse 20, Exodus 22 and verse 20. Very brief and to the point. It says, "Whoever sacrifices to a god other than the eternal alone must be utterly destroyed." Not much ambiguity in that statement. We look at Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 through 14. Deuteronomy 12. Verses 1 through 14. This is to the nation of Israel. "These are the statutes and judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the eternal your God, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess, as long as you live on the earth." Verse 2, "You must by all means destroy all the places where the nations you are about to dispossess worship their gods, on the high mountains and hills, and under every leafy tree. You must tear down their altars, shatter their sacred pillars, burn up their sacred Asherah poles, cut down the images of their gods. You must eliminate their very memory from that place." We'll come back to that concept in a while. "You must not worship the Lord your God the way they worship. You must seek only the place he chooses from all your tribes to establish his name as a place of residence, and you must go there. And there you must take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the personal offerings you have prepared, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. Both you and your families must feast there before the Lord your God, and rejoice in all the output of your labor, which he has blessed you. You must not do like we are doing here today, with everyone doing what seems best to him. For you have not yet come to the final stop and inheritance the Lord your God has given you. When you go across the Jordan and settle in the land he is granting you as inheritance, and you find relief from all the enemies who surround you, you will live in safety. Then you must come to the place the Lord your God chooses for his name to reside, bringing everything I am commanding you, your burnt offerings, sacrifices, tithes, the personal offerings you have prepared, and all your choice votive offerings which you devote to him. You shall rejoice in the presence of the Lord your God, along with your sons, daughters, men and women servants, and Levites in your villages, since they do not have an allotment or inheritance. Make sure you do not offer burnt offerings in any place you wish, for you may do so only in the place the Lord chooses in one of your tribal areas. There you may do everything I am commanding you." To synchronize the inclusivist and exclusivist, they can be reconciled. We know that there will be a time of punishment on this earth where God will clean things up. And in the end, there will be peace in perfect harmony with God. If we look over at Zechariah 14, gives us a little quick synopsis of what some of the events will be. Zechariah 14. Let's begin in verse 2. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to wage war. The city will be taken, its houses plundered, and the women ravished, and half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go to battle and fight against those nations, just as he fought battles in ancient days. And on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies to the east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west, leaving a great valley. Half of the mountain will move northward, and the other half southward. Then you will escape through my mountain valley, for the mountains will extend to us all. Indeed, you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come with all his holy ones with him. Drop down to verse 16. Then all who survive from all the nations that came to attack Jerusalem will go up annually to worship the King, the Lord, who rules over all, and to observe the Feast of Tabernacles. Things will be resolved and at peace again. But if any of the nations anywhere on earth refuse to go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord who rules over all, they will get no rain. And if the Egyptians do not do so, they will get no rain. Instead, there will be a kind of plague. There will be the kind of plague which the Lord inflicts on nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. This will be the punishment of all the nations that do not go up. And on that day, the bells of the horses will bear the inscription, Holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots will be holy. And every cooking pot in Jerusalem will become holy in the sight of the Lord who rules over all, so that all who offer sacrifices may come and use some of them to boil their sacrifices in them. And on that day there will be no longer a Canaanite, and that's translated, can be a merchant, in the house of the Lord who rules over all. Everything will be resolved. Their exclusive purity in God's way. Pluralism, further, has come to mean the efforts between different denominations and different faiths to form an overall spiritual community. This is often used by leaders of the Christian faith to promote unity between the many different doctrines of Christianity. Because many religions have a similar basic goal or belief, proponents argue they should be able to work together. Those who identify themselves as practitioners of religious pluralism often mean that they have built their personal spiritual doctrine on a wide variety of traditional religious beliefs, rather than subscribing to one particular religious sect. Pluralists pick and choose which beliefs resonate with them. And that gets into the syncretism. Regardless of the source, often they believe in relativism, which suggests that all possible explanations of religious beliefs must be equal, as no conclusive evidence proving one idea right has ever been found. Pluralists may attend many different spiritual services and rituals with traditional churches, or they may choose to focus on an individual's spirituality. The concept of religious pluralism is tricky, particularly in regards to logical analysis. Many religions flatly contradict one another on some point or another, making pluralists stuck in the middle on some arguments. The goal behind all definitions of the term is meant to unite people despite different backgrounds and belief systems. Historically, the efforts have had mixed results, but they are often praised as attempts to further society. Notice that the focus is on unity and inclusiveness rather than on purity and correctness. Now, syncretism is the related idea that you combine or merge aspects of different religions into a new belief system. Many young adults today, Katy Perry is an example that I've heard about, they approach religion or spirituality as kind of a cosmic salad bar. The ingredients of all the world religions are there, and they just pick what they like. You don't like hell? Forget that. We won't talk about that. If you like, how about forgiveness and turning the other cheek? Okay, let's take a lot of that. Turn that on. Not that that's necessarily bad, But when you're in this mindset, then you become your own God. When you design your salad, as it were, from this cosmic salad bar instead of God. There's a recent article in the HuffPost that I read was talking about they're trying to syncretize Judaism and, quote, Christianity. And this is by Brad Hirschfield. He claims the title of rabbi, but he says it this way. Syncretism is simply the word for a religious borrowing project whose success is not yet assured, but ultimately doesn't gain popular support or which some current religious authorities don't like. They may be right and they may be wrong, but really only time will tell. And that is especially true for someone like this new menorah. And this article was about a menorah composed of pine branches with candles on the end. So it had 7 pine branches. Typically, such Hanukkah Christmas blends have been attempts to squeeze a bit of Jewish into something which is obviously and primarily Christian. We have had the Hanukkah bush, which both with multicolored lights or with the more Jewish blue only or blue and white lights. You can purchase Christmas tree ornaments decorated with Jewish images. I could go on, but you get the point. In each case above, the idea was to graft something Jewish on so that Jews would feel more comfortable participating in what are typically thought of as Christian rituals. Aside from being motivated by the same spirit of inclusivity, the menorah tree is something quite different. It proudly proclaims itself as a Jewish object onto which a bit of the dominant culture's decorations may be added. It is, in the words of its creators, not a Jewish Christmas tree. Who could argue? It's a giant menorah. Now, there's some famous examples of pluralism and syncretism in ancient Israel, one being Rehoboam and the temple. We go to 1 Kings 11. First Kings 11, verse 29 is where we'll start. And it came about at that time when Jeroboam had left Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the road, and the two of them were alone in the open country. And Ahijah was wearing a brand new robe. And he grabbed the robe and tore it into 12 pieces. And he told Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces, for this is what the Lord God of Israel said. Look, I'm about to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand, and I will give 10 tribes to you. He will retain 1 tribe. For my servant David's sake, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." Verse 33, "I am taking the kingdom from him because they have abandoned me and worshipped the Sidonian goddess Astarte, the Moabite god Chemosh, and the Ammonite god Milcom. They have not followed my instruction by doing what I approve and obeying my rules and regulations like Solomon's father David did. I will not take the whole kingdom from his hand. I will allow him to be a ruler for the rest of his life for the sake of my chosen servant David, who kept my commandments and rules. I will take the kingdom from the hand of his son and give 10 tribes to you. And I will leave his son 1 tribe so my servant David's dynasty may continue to serve me in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen as my home. I will select you, Jeroboam. You will rule over all you desire to have, and you will be king over Israel. You must obey all I command you to do. Follow my instructions. Do what I approve. Keep my rules and commandments, like my servant David did. Then I will give you and establish for you a lasting dynasty. As I did for David, I will give you Israel." There's a promise, a direct promise from God through his prophet, that he would have a lasting dynasty. "I will humiliate David's descendants because of this, but not forever." Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam because Jeroboam escaped to Egypt and found refuge with King Shishak. Now, the story continues, and Solomon died, and his son reigned in his stead. So we step down to verse 12, or chapter 12, and verse 26 to continue this story. Well, let's go step back and begin in verse 25. And then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country and lived there, and he went out from there and built Penuel. And he was established as king of Israel, not of Judah. Then Jeroboam said in his heart, if these people go up to offer sacrifices to the Lord's in the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, their loyalty could shift to their former master, King Rehoboam of Judah, and they might kill me and return to King Rehoboam. And after the king consulted with his advisors, he made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much trouble for you to go up from Jerusalem to Jerusalem. Look, Israel, here are your gods that brought you up from the land of Egypt. He put one in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this caused Israel to sin. The people went to Bethel and Dan to worship the calves. And he built temples in the high places and appointed priests, people who were not Levites. And Jeroboam inaugurated a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival celebrated in Judah. On the altar in Bethel, he offered sacrifices to the calves he made. In Bethel, he also appointed priests for the high places he had made. And on the 15th day of the 8th month, a date he had arbitrarily chosen, Jeroboam offered sacrifices on the altar he had made in Bethel. He inaugurated a festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to offer sacrifices. Technically, the religion was still Yahweh worship, as they say, as it was practiced in the temple. He followed the same rites. He had priests that tried to follow the same practices, but he corrupted it. He added 2 locations that God had specifically said not to do. He added 2 blatant idols, syncretized, and he appointed a priesthood loyal to himself rather than God. And I suspect there was some intimidation to encourage those who might have wanted to go to Judah to remain in Israel. Now, if we look around at the church, we can see remnants and activities similar to this as well. We can see intimidation. We can see various practices to keep people loyal to their, quote, group, to their person. Now, times change. These were also evident in the early church. The syncretization, the changes, the wandering off to worship various gods, various Jesuses, all with different origins. Times change, but people have the same fears and the same attitudes. And when the leadership, like Jeroboam, fears a loss of position or power more than God, the response is the same. In Ezekiel 34, verses 4 and 5, you have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bandaged the injured, and brought back the strays, or sought the lost, but with force and harshness. It's Ezekiel 34, verse 4 and 5. Force, with the King James Version says force and cruelty, you have ruled over them. They were scattered because they had no shepherd, and they became food for every wild beast. Now, the word translated harshness and cruelty there is the same word used in Exodus 1, 13 and 14, where the Egyptians, Exodus 1, 13 and 14, where they made the Israelites serve rigorously. And they made their lives bitter by hard service with mortar and bricks and by all kinds of service in the fields. Every kind of service the Israelites were required to give was rigorous. So it's the same word, same meaning, that the pastors ruled over them with rigor and with, I guess I shouldn't say pastor, because pastor indicates somebody who's loving and kind. But their rulers ruled over them with harshness and cruelty. Now there's another natural occurrence that when combined with these practices syncretism and pluralism, can cause us problems and actually aggravate the situation. Now, it's designed into the physical. It's a natural law, as it were. It's entropy. And entropy states that matter must move from order to chaos, or from activity to inactivity, or from higher energy to lack of energy. And when this occurs in nature, bright becomes dim, shiny becomes dull, hot becomes cool. I think you know where I'm going. We look at Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11. Because the sentence is not executed at once against a crime, the human heart is encouraged to do evil. Even though a sinner might commit 100 crimes and still live a long time, yet I know that it will go well with God-fearing people, for they stand in fear before him. This also, we can reflect back to the warnings in Revelation 2 and 3, particularly 3 for the Laodicean era, which we are in. Now, the world is filled with anger. And I just read an article this morning, or just saw an article this morning, about there's an anger epidemic, particularly in the United States, that there's huge increase in outbursts of anger from all levels. And when I look around, you see what happened in Benghazi, what's happening in Syria, what's happened in Libya, and all the anger and rage that's going on. You see the level of rage in people when you're driving and among your neighbors. And there's a quotation that applies very well to the world in which we live, and it's a quote from The Search for Peace by Douglas Hurd. The speed of modern communications, far from simplifying the issues, tends to complicate them. It increases the number of reports and the number of people who wish to get a word in edgewise. It virtually removes the safety gap between the issuing of an order and its implementation. Anyone who has lived through the center of a crisis, then later reads an account of it in the newspapers or from historians, knows how impossible it is to recapture with any fullness the motives and calculations of those involved. Gone are the days of elaborate written documents and carefully recorded conversations. Each crisis generates its own fog of incomplete information, mixed emotions, and exhaustion. Now, our comfort is knowing that every work is going to be brought to light. We do not have to have every bit of gossip or the latest information. We know the end of the story. There will be peace, and that peace will come after the trouble. So that gives us a level of patience that we need to maintain. We cannot bring the rage in the world into our lives. Ecclesiastes again, chapter 12 and verse 14. Because God will bring every secret thing, whether it be good, or work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Numbers 32 and verse 23 is another quick reference. But if you do not do this, then look, you will have sinned against the Lord, and know that your sin will find you out. Now, we do live in a time of increasing turmoil. We know that Esau's descendants are growing increasingly restless, and in their recent successes in Egypt and Libya have led to the current tumultuous situation in Syria. We know from Genesis 27 that Esau will break the yoke of Jacob. It began following the establishment of the nation of Israel and is still progressing. So how is this relevant to our life? How is the bristlecone relevant to this? Well, the tree is an example of the most necessary ingredients of our character. Steady growth through adversity and endurance. We maintain what we know, maintain our way of life. As I said, it lives in an environment that is inherently hostile to plants. And we know that Satan's world is inherently hostile to us. It lives in shallow limestone soil with limited precipitation, desiccating heat in the summer, and high winds. We're facing severe times. How is this relevant to us? We don't have to borrow anger. Even though we're placed in an increasingly hostile environment, we don't have to syncretize our activity in our life with the world in any way. One of the newer, quote-unquote, games you've probably heard about recently, I heard about it more than a year ago as something that was a trending thing. It's called Knockout. And it's typically a group of young urban thugs without a hint of compassion. And the other participants, if you can call them that, are chosen at random. And they're generally helpless, smaller individuals, older individuals, by themselves, a single person. And this group will go up to them, and the idea is to knock them out, knock the person unconscious with a single punch. I mean, that's the world we live in, and we can become angry and frustrated with that. Our own government is out of control. Now, the motto of the police force might be to protect and serve, but even the local police has become increasingly militaristic. There have been more and more attempts to rein them in and control them, which have not worked. The federal government is providing funds for military vehicles for our police. They're creating more of an occupying army than a group of individuals whose aim is to serve. One recent example from New Mexico illustrates a horrible extreme. The police thought a man stopped for a traffic violation was hiding drugs. They thought he had him in his colon. So they arrested him, and then they subjected him to proctological probes, enemas, and x-rays. Not once, but multiple times. They could not believe that he did not have drugs. Now, they were done with a search warrant, and yes, this is an extreme example, but there are thousands of other examples yearly that are just as disturbing. So, how is that relevant to us? Why do I even mention it? Because we could be caught in a similar situation. We could be stopped. The random roadside stops are becoming more common, where they call you in. And all it takes is the wrong word, the wrong gesture. In this particular case, the man was standing and they thought he was clenching his buttocks. Just the way he was standing. And he was subjected to that. Are you going to be angry? How are you going to handle it? Are you going to be violent? Are you going to bring that anger into your life? I think I'm going to skip over some things here, go more directly. Let's go to Acts 13 and verse 45. Now, this is just a quick reference. Paul and Barnabas were having great success with the Gentiles. And I just want to refer to verse 45. It says, "But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. And they began to contradict what Paul was saying by reviling him." We could be facing reviling. We could be facing some nasty accusations. Let's go to 2 Peter 2 and verse 10. This is just a warning for us. In the same way, looking the wrong one, but especially those who go after the unclean desires of the flesh and make sport of authority, ready to take chances, uncontrolled. They have no fear of saying evil of those in high places. This goes to our response to abusive authority or to those who would like to revile us. There's another warning in Jude 8. Yet in the same way these dreamers make the flesh unclean, having no respect for authorities, and say evil of rulers. Let's go back to 2 Peter. Second Peter 2. I'm in 1 Peter. 2 Peter 2, and we'll go back to 10 and verse 11. Whereas angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing, that's slanderous, reproachful, or abusive accusation, and that's condemnation, sentence, or damnation against them before the eternal. In modern terms, abusive language. Notice the definition of that word translated railing. Blasphemous. It's translated from the Greek, blasphemos. Speaking evil or slanderous, reproachful, railing, and abusive. Back in Jude, in verse 9, says, Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses. He dared not bring a railing accusation, but said, The Lord rebuke you. So we know what our response is to be. To attack. Notice again the expanded definition. Any slander, any detraction, or speech injurious to another's good name. Impious and reproachful speech, injurious to divine majesty. I doubt if any of us want to be in the group that is doing that. But you may also say, I understand that false witness violates the letter of the commandment, but the truth is the ultimate defense. Remember Jude 9. We cannot stoop to violence in our speech or in our actions. Michael had truth on his side, but he was not violent in his attack. He said, God rebuke you. Perfect, holy, and righteous character is the ability in a separate entity to come to discern the true and right way from the false, to make voluntarily a full and unconditional surrender to God. That is where we are to be, in His perfect way, to yield to be conquered by God, to determine against self-temptation or self-desire to live and do the right. We can't accept or syncretize or blend anything that the world does that's in violation with God's law. We know these things are going to happen. When you read the Bible from cover to cover, you know that about Cain and Korah, Alexander the coppersmith. There are many other examples of those who did damage to God's servants. We have to be particularly careful when we're dealing with others in the greater church, as it were, because God called our brethren. And if the angels do not dare to bring accusation against Satan, we need to be extra careful in dealing with our brethren. Another area where we can syncretize is in today's activities. We're entering the season of joy, as I mentioned. Maybe I should say season's greetings. Don't worry. Not really. I was recently studying astrology and did a word search on astrologers and whatnot, and ended up looking at Isaiah 47. You turn over there for a minute. Isaiah 47. What I found was astounding, and this is just the beginning. Isaiah 47 verse 1 tells who it's talking about. It's talking about Babylon, and this chapter should probably be in the sarcasm font, because this 47 verse 12 and 13 is very sarcastic in a lot of ways. God's telling him to stand fast now with your spells and your sorceries, which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to profit. Perhaps you may cause trembling. You are wearied with your many counsels. Now let the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars, those who predict by the new moons, stand up and save you from what will come upon you. That's verse 13. There, the word translated astrologers is those who lisp or practice enchantment. A necromancer or conjurer. Or it can be astrologer, enchanter, or exorcist. The stargazers comes from a word that was also used to describe advisors to David and other righteous kings. So it's a true advisor, and it's usually translated advisor in the new translations. The monthly prognosticators were those in the know. They had the knowledge, understanding, and to know and to be able to perceive. The Net New English Translation puts it this way: persist in trusting your amulets and your incantations, which you have faithfully recited since your youth. Maybe you will be successful. Maybe you will scare away disaster. You are tired out from listening to so much advice. Let them take their stand, the ones who see omens in the sky, who gaze at the stars, who make monthly predictions. Let them rescue you from the disaster that is about to overtake you. Now, Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown has a little article about the astrologers. And it says that literally they were the ones who formed the combination of the heavens, who watch conjunctions and oppositions and configurations of the sky. Gesenius explains it the dividers of the heavens. In casting a nativity, they observed 4 signs: the horoscope, or a sign which arose at the time one was born; the midheaven, the sign opposite the horoscope toward the west; and the hypogee. Monthly prognosticators, those who at each new moon profess to tell what is about to happen. So these are the astrologers. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Jeremiah 10. Jeremiah 10, verse 1, says, "Hear the word which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Eternal, do not learn the way of the nations. Do not be terrified by the signs of the heavens, although the nations are terrified by them. For the customs of the people are a delusion, because it is wood cut from the forest, the work of the hands of the craftsman with the cutting of the tool." The important verse there is verse 2. Do not be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them. We can fairly easily link the celebrations of this time of year to sun worship, to these pagan practices, and then fairly easily dismiss them as, quote, pagan, unquote. But what about the rest of the year? What about all those other things that we might enjoy? How do they figure in, and how do they fit together? We know that those of us in the United States are kind of shallow, and our attention span is pretty short. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit and see what else might fit here. How about birthday celebrations? So how did I get from astrology to birthdays? Well, once I studied these verses, I started to research horoscopes, which led to birthdays, which led to birthstones. Now we know that the church has traditionally avoided birthday celebrations, but why? I'm going to read part of a personal correspondence letter. We're jumping in the Wayback Machine here. This goes back to 1988. Talks about some of the things that we'll go into in a minute. It says, on the other hand, a birthday celebration with its usual trappings, inviting guests, giving elaborate gifts, baking and decorating a cake, lighting candles, and so forth, is an entirely different matter. This kind of festivity tends to accentuate flattery and vanity, the I, me, my attitude, and the get rather than give way of life. Vanity and glorifying the self, of course, are condemned in God's Word, and lists some scriptures which we won't go to right now. If you're interested, I'll give them to you. So on. If we can be of additional service, please let us know. Close the letter. Well, selfishness is definitely not a trait a true Christian would want to have. But let's notice these quotes from H.W.'s autobiography. He talked about my mother's 80th birthday, and this is in volume 2 of the autobiography. It says, my mother reached her 80th birthday April 21st, 1946. Although the biblical instruction of God shows that only pagans celebrated birthdays, and Mrs. Armstrong and I have not done so since learning this truth, my sister, who lived in Portland, was of a religious denomination that does follow this custom. And she had planned a celebration for Mother at her home, and it was up to me to get Mother there. So then he goes on to recount how he got her there and how he helped her, and they did have this celebration. Then in the Worldwide News, 1985, he did a recent history of the Philadelphia era of the Worldwide Church of God regarding the issues raised in the early 70s by liberals attempting to push the systematic theology project. These liberals wanted complete freedom in the church for divorce and remarriage at will. Same agenda that we're seeing around us today. Complete freedom to do whatever you choose, regardless of whether it's correct. Other questions raised by the liberals were complete freedom for any type of marriage, some more and some less freedom from tithing, doing away with or modifying church teachings on healing by direct prayer, as in James 5:14, complete freedom for women in facial makeup, which is another issue which we won't address, and even the approval of celebrating birthdays, never approved in the Bible, and even of voting in elections as part of the world. Notice the focus. This is the focus that we want to look at. They wanted to become accepted and more like the society around them rather than complying with God's way. Today, the society continues to press us to accept diverse lifestyles and cultures which are not approved by God. The pressure to syncretize has not eased. If anything, it is intensified. Now we're going even farther back in the Wayback Machine to a letter that was sent out in November 1966. It says, you know, I am sure that Christmas, December 25th, is not Jesus' birthday. He was not born anywhere near December 25th. Rather, originally, it was celebrated as the birthday of the sun god. By the calendar then used, December 25th was regarded as the nativity or the birth of the sun, because the sun begins to lengthen and the power of the sun to increase in that time of day in the northern hemisphere. So Christmas is a birthday celebration. December 25th, the birthday of the sun god, later assigned to Jesus. So there's a connection. Now notice, it's from another article in 1966 entitled St. Valentine's Day. Nimrod, the Baal or sun god of the ancient pagans, was said to have been born at the winter solstice. In ancient times, the solstice occurred on January 6th, and his birthday therefore was celebrated on January 6th. Later, as the solstice changed, it was celebrated on December 25th and is now called Christmas. It was the custom of antiquity for the mother of a male child to present herself for purification on the 40th day after the birth. And the 40th day after January 6th, Nimrod's original birth date, takes us to February 15th, the celebration of which began on the evening of February 14th, the Lupercalia, or St. Valentine's Day. So now we have a link between two celebrations as well. Found an interesting excerpt here from a webpage on the history of the Valentine's card. It says, Germany is credited with providing the expensive paper and elaborate borders to Valentines in the 18th century. But they were not given on Valentine's, but more often on New Year's Day or on a person's birthday. This is from a book titled Birthdays, Their Delights, Disappointments, Past and Present, Worldly, Astrological, and Infamous, by Linda Rennells Lewis. Among prosperous Greek families, a birth feast, a coming-of-age feast, and feasts after death held on the anniversary of the day of birth were observed. But otherwise, there were no annual birthday ceremonial. The birthdays of the immortals were ritually acknowledged once a month. However, the third day of each month being sacred to Athena, Ares, and Saturn, for example. In the Dictionary of Classical Antiquities by Oscar Seifert, the Italian peoples regarded the genius as a higher power which creates and maintains life, assists at the begetting and birth of every individual man, determines his character, tries to influence his destiny for good, and accompanies him through life as his tutelary spirit, and lives on in the lares after his death. Now the lares was a chamber or a room in the house where the bones of the ancestors were stored. It was actually kept in the house, in the Italian household. Now a man's birthday was naturally the holiday of his attendant genius, to whom he offered incense, wine, garlands, cakes, everything in short of bloody sacrifice, and in whose honor he gave himself up to pleasure and enjoyment. Notice, he gave himself up to pleasure and enjoyment in honor of his genius, which could have been Athena, Ares, Saturn, any of the pantheon of gods. Two birthday celebrations are mentioned in the Bible, and both instances are related to tragic events. Now you can read them in Genesis 40:20, Matthew 14:6, and again in Mark 6:21. I won't go and read all of those. And there's also a vague reference in Job 1, verses 4, 13, and 18, I think it is, that seem to infer that Job's children gathering on their day might be their birthdays. And Job 3 kind of lends credence to that in some respects, when Job says in Job 3:1, after this Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. And he goes on to discuss the day of his birth. So I don't really see that is a reference to a birthday, because that word used is specific to the day of one's birth, not to the anniversary celebration. So the link in Job is circumstantial. Now, being linked to a tragedy is not enough to disqualify a practice. So let's see what more we can learn about this practice. Now, we've seen the link to astrology and of pagan worship, which is a large part of the occult practice. But there is more. This again is a quote from the Birthdays, Their Delights, Disappointments, etc. by Linda Lewis. Birthdays have been celebrated for thousands of years. In early civilizations where the development of a calendar made an organized reckoning of birth dates possible, the horoscopes of ruling monarchs, their successors and rivals, had to be cast with care and birthday omens meticulously examined, for the prospects of the mighty would affect the prospects of the entire society. Notice what is so significant about the days of one birth: the relationship to the omens cast. In researching birthstones, I came across an interesting website that provides various stones. They provide counseling for those as to which stones you should use to offset a bad influence in your life or that sort of thing. And it just gives a short history. And it says, all the religions of the world mention the use of crystals or gemstones for protection, healing, and contemplation as being a guide through the development of a person's individuality on a spiritual or material plane. In every world's nation, there has been and still exist experts who know the secret relationship between humans and stones, whether through scientific methods or through insight and identification with the matter. The effects and the use of crystals or gemstones are often mentioned in the astrology of the East and the West, and this science, I would not quite classify it as a science, connects crystals and gemstones with the influence of planets and stars, affecting the whole of living with the spectrum of their radiation. Determining the appropriate crystal or gemstone through the use of astrology depends on the position of the planets at the moment of birth, and if the influence of a certain planet is considered disturbing, it is recommended that a person wears a certain crystal or gemstone to diminish or neutralize these negative effects. Now, they go into such detail that they want the exact minute of your birth. Very, very detailed. Rulers are concerned about their omen and those of their rivals that their horoscopes are meticulously cast. It's still being done. Further, the source of our modern birthday celebrations is linked to practices surrounding the worship of various gods. It's another excerpt from the birthdays. If the cake is a mark of favor and eating it suggests growth, what does the candle suggest? Personal prayer? Fertility is represented by a phallus. When the Greeks stuck candles into round honey cakes and placed them on the altars sacred to the moon goddess Artemis, they did so to secure her beneficence, we are told. When European peasants lit candles around the cakes as soon as the birthday child awoke and kept them lit all day, replacing them as necessary until the cake was eaten at the evening meal, they meant to assure the child's well-being. For the same purpose, on the birthdays of their children, many families would burn an enormous 12-year candle from one mark down to the next, and then put it away till next year. The fire was kept going throughout at the candle or on the cake throughout the day as a omen to keep them healthy throughout the coming year. Christmas, the celebration of the birth of the Son of God, is one obvious birthday model, a hopeful, simple, magical image, but it is not quite right. For most of the Middle Ages, it was Twelfth Night, the celebration of the baptism of the baby Jesus, that was the more popular fete. And it is this festival from which our birthday rites may have been adapted. Twelfth Night, occurring on the 6th of January, has probable connections with a much earlier Greek festival, which we already saw, the Linnea, the celebration of the birth of the god Dionysius, who had been ritually and spectacularly conceived 10 months earlier. In the Linnea, a rowdy crowd carried a large phallus around the town in a procession. And the medieval feast of the Epiphany, on Twelfth Night, huge candles were carried in a somewhat more sober parade. Songs and dances, rough and tumble games, dramatic performances, and other entertainments, vast quantities of food and drink are common to the midwinter festivals of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe. At the Roman Saturnalia, a king for the day was chosen by lot. At the Feast of the Epiphany, he or she who found the bean or coin that had been baked in the cake was designated the Lord of Misrule. In all European countries, children were included in the party and were indeed necessary for the performance of certain of the rituals. It may seem far-fetched to see in the roisterous communal festivals associated with Twelfth Night or the Linnea any connection to the sedate, lace-collared Victorian birthday party, which we're kind of more familiar with, but there are similarities that suggest links. Children, gifts, king or queen for the day, songs, cakes and sweets, candles, and all associated with the birth of a new year. So what conclusion can we draw from all of this? Well, we can be very clear. We can understand that the Babylonian mystery religion has completely saturated the practices of modern Israel. That there is no place that we can turn that is not polluted in some way. We need to remember the admonition in Deuteronomy 12. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 12. Let's look at verse 2. Deuteronomy 12 and verse 2. You must by all means destroy all the places where the nations you are about to dispossess worship their gods. On the high mountains and hills and under every leafy tree, you must tear down their altars, shatter their sacred pillars, burn up their sacred Asherah poles, and cut down the images of their gods. You must eliminate their very memory from that place. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 10. Second Corinthians 10, verses 4 to 5. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. If we do not pour energy into maintaining and building and purifying our faith, it wanes. We allow syncretization. We pluralize. We begin to think that everything is okay. Let's go over to Titus. Titus chapter 3. Let's begin in verse 1. Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to obedient, to be ready for every good deed. Verse 2. They must not slander anyone, but be peaceable, gentle, showing complete courtesy to all people. For we too were once foolish, disobedient, misled, enslaved to various passions and desires, spending our lives in evil and envy, hateful and hating one another. But when the kindness of God our Savior and His love for mankind appeared, He saved us not by works of righteousness that we have done, but on the basis of His mercy through the washing of the new birth and the renewing of the Holy Spirit, whom He poured out on us in full measure through Jesus Christ our Savior. So, since we have been justified by His grace, we become heirs with confident expectation of eternal life. Now notice verse 8. This saying is trustworthy. I want you to insist on such truths so that those who have placed their faith in God may be intent on engaging in good works. These things are good and beneficial for all people. What is the purpose of the church at this time? What should the focus of the bride be at this time? Purification, removing the spot. Let's go to Colossians 1. Colossians 1, verse 10. So you may walk in a worthy manner. Spit it out, Tim. So that you may live worthily of the Lord and please Him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good deed, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for the display of all patience and steadfastness, joyfully giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the saints' inheritance in the light. He delivered us from the power of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of the Son he loves. So we live in interesting times. We know we cannot syncretize or pluralize our religion. We cannot participate in the violence surrounding us. We cannot participate in the practices of this world. So remember, endurance. Remember the example of the bristlecone. Rejoice in trials. Endure. Be patient. Remember, we're in small clusters. Slow, steady growth through endurance in this hostile environment.